We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord, we are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord, and we pray that all unity may one day be restored, and they'll know we are Christian by our love, yes, they'll know we are Christian by our love.
The Church of the Brethren has a history of over 300 years. Founded in Germany, its members came to this country seeking religious freedom. Historically, down through the years, it has attempted to become a multi-ethnic church. In 2007, its annual conference recommended that a staff position be created that would assist the church to become more diverse. For the last 4 years now, Gimbia Kettering has been the coordinator of Intercultural Ministries for the Church of the Brethren. We were able to meet with her at the Pacific Northwest District Spring Event near Lacey, Washington. Gimbia Kettering, welcome to Brethren Voices.
Thank you very much, Brother Ben.
It's very nice that you have come out to the Northwest and you're spending a little time with us. We're very grateful for that.
It has been such a wonderful experience. I felt so welcomed being in this space and being in this time.
Welcoming is a very important theme in many places during this time because sometimes we're not so welcoming. I want to just kind of get your perspective in terms of the Church of the Brethren coming to America 300 years ago and being kind of kicked out of Germany. And have they in turn have a history of welcoming others as they have dealt with people who are not so welcome in certain areas?
Sometimes I think we like to imagine that history is a monolithic thing, and we want to say, what is our history, as if it can be summed up in a moment. And in fact, there's so many stories and so many strains of stories. And some of them are amazingly welcoming. When I was in Elgin this past week, they had put up pictures from the Japanese internment camps and told the story of Ralph Smeltzer, who went to the camps, who was providing aid and comfort to people in this terrible life transition, and then helped them when the camps were then closed and coming back into society. And these stories of incredible welcome against an incredible American story that's the exact opposite of welcome. And in that moment, there was this incredible Brethren story, but you have to know that that's one man's story, and there were surely other stories that weren't as welcoming, or maybe were silent in that moment. And I can think of several times in our history where we've had stories of people being incredibly welcoming, but there are also stories that we don't tell, or maybe aren't even aware of, where we weren't welcoming. And I think the challenge to be a community that embraces its whole history means that we have to lament where we have fallen short in the welcome that's possible, the welcome that's needed, as well as celebrate the small stories where that we've been successful in welcoming people, and to change our narrative in such a way that we're able to embrace both, but call ourselves into the ideal welcome that is imagined by Scripture.
I sometimes experience a dichotomy of individual welcoming versus the congregational welcoming. And sometimes congregations are welcoming and sometimes they're not. Sometimes individuals are welcoming and sometimes they're not. And I think about your conversation with Matt Gwynn. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, the church really stepped out to welcome people in Nigeria to the church, to share the Church of the Brethren point of view. And yet, at the same time, we weren't doing that in America. So somehow, it was easier or more practical or just more expedient to welcome people in Africa than it was in our own country. Do you have any idea how that works, or what happened to us?
I think there's so many different answers to that. I obviously wasn't there.
Me neither.
In the 1920s. I wonder, in many ways, what were the other church politics of the moment that might have been happening? I think sometimes a few people have a vision, and they are people that are so inspiring that we're able to follow those people just about anywhere. And so somebody mentioned that it was 2 men on horseback that went into Nigeria.
Who brought the Church of the Brethren to Nigeria. Yeah.
And I sort of think, wow, 2 men on horseback, and these 2 men must have had a story and had a vision and had a compelling moment, or maybe it was the 2 men that came after them. And we oftentimes think about Heifer Project, and it was Dan West who had a vision, was able to do that. And so sometimes I think 2 people can have, or a few people can have a vision compelling enough, and they are charismatic enough and articulate enough, and it's in the right place at the right time, that it grows beyond them. And by contrast, I think that society can be so close to an idea that no matter how much an individual may want it, the push against the wider society is so intense that it just gets shut down over and over on so many levels. And so when I try to imagine America in the 1920s, when I try to imagine the Church of the Brethren in America in the 1920s, it would have been such a radical space for a group of Christians who look white, or at least whitish, to America, to stand with Black Christians and Black Americans and to say, you are our brothers and we're going to do this outreach here. In some ways, by doing it so far away, we weren't under the scrutiny of our neighbors who would have judged us. We weren't under the scrutiny of our own values that say this isn't possible in this context. And I think we didn't believe it was possible. We didn't imagine it. And if you can't imagine it, you can't even begin to do it.
Mimi, you're in charge of intercultural ministries for the Church of the Brethren. And you're a multicultural person.
Yes.
Could you just kind of give us a quick overview of your family? Because it's fascinating. And you represent feet in different places, in different countries, and different cultures, just by being here.
I do. I am blood brethren, many generations on my father's side, which is how I have the name Kettering. I'm from the Ohio Ketterings, and my dad's family is white brethren. And I oftentimes say there's possibly nothing whiter than dairy farmers from northern Ohio, which is where I come from. My mother is Jamaican, and Jamaica discusses race differently than the US, but for expedient purposes, we'll say she's Black Jamaican. And so I also have that experience. It means I'm the descendant of slaves, because that is how Black people came to be in Jamaica. I grew up in Nairobi, Kenya, from ages 8 to 18, and then even went back after college for a while. And so I have that experience of what they call being a third culture kid, which means that your parents are from a culture different than the culture you're growing up, so you foster a third culture. I oftentimes relate very well to the missionary kids and have very close relationships. These third culture kids, I mean, these are women now in their 50s and 60s in our denomination, but who grew up as daughters of the missionaries in Nigeria. When I came to the United States, this is the body I have. This is my hair, my nose, my skin color, and I'm perceived as an African American. In African American culture, I mentioned that I went to college in Tennessee. The African Americans in Tennessee realized very quickly that I needed to know some things about being Black in this context that I hadn't learned yet. And they taught it to me. In many ways, I often say that African American culture was my foster culture. They were very welcoming to me at a time in my life when I was in a lot of transition.
Our special theme music for this program, They Will Know We Are Christians by Our Love, was sung by Lee Bird of Cross Keys Village of New Oxford, Pennsylvania. And we found it to be so right for this program, as both Lee and Gimbia attended Maryville College in Tennessee. Lee tells his own story about the integration of Maryville College when he attended in 1956. You can check out his wonderful story about the integration of Maryville College on our YouTube channel, www.youtube.com/Brethren Voices. It's titled Lee Bird, the 1950s integration of Maryville College. So we were talking about your cultural background and your father from Ohio, your mother from Jamaica, but you have a little bit more intercultural, international blood in you.
I think a better way to say that is that my family has grown and expanded in ways that I could have never predicted. In the US, much of our conversation about race is black and white, and that history is very long and very intense. And so we oftentimes have those conversations, and I will admit I thought I knew it all because I had such great access to both of those perspectives, those stories, very naturally through my family. I ended up dating and marrying a man who is Chinese Singaporean American, which falls under the general Asian American umbrella. And it has opened my perspective in so many ways to other ways that race impacts families and individuals, to different stories and narratives around immigration and ethnicity and language. And now that also is becoming a part of my family heritage. We have 2 daughters together and are very committed to them learning to speak Mandarin because it's a part of his family culture, part of his family story, and wanting to be intentional about making sure that they also will have a window into that world and into that part of their family story.
How do you experience being in a black culture, being in a white culture, being in an Asian culture when you're visiting different members and groups in your family? Because I'm just curious, because you have a unique connection with each of those. Do you find you're comfortable in them, or?
Well, I am both comfortable and uncomfortable at various times. When I visit my family, the primary thing is always family. And it is the closeness that family has, that closeness that is so wonderful and so cozy and incredibly claustrophobic. Mm-hmm. It is true that my family also sometimes lives in places that are not actually multicultural, so I can go and visit family in places that are monoculture, and I can be aware, particularly while traveling, that the people that I've been with and the people I'm going to, I see that transition happen. You know, you get on the plane with one group of people in the majority, and you get off the plane and there's another group of people in the majority. And those wider cultural pieces surround any of those visits. And I can at times, again, be very comfortable and very uncomfortable. I'm not somebody, there's some people who are cultural chameleons and they can fit in better. That's not who I am. I'm very much Gimbia everywhere I go, and I don't immediately blend in anywhere. So in some ways, I'm always very comfortable because I'm comfortable enough to be myself. And in other ways, I'm always a little bit uncomfortable because people look at me and can see right away I don't belong.
So you were in Kenya from 8 to 18. How did you get a Nigerian name?
My dad, of the Northern Ohio Ketterings, Merlin, did Peace Corps in northern Nigeria. And he loved, it's not usually a name in Nigeria, it's a word. It means daughter of the Emir. And when I was born, that is the name that he had on his heart. Yeah, I feel like it was saved for me. I really do.
Let's talk about intercultural ministries. What is your job? What do you do?
I do a lot of what's asked of me. Other duties as assigned often feels like my most accurate job description. But the position itself comes out of the 2007 paper called Separate No More. This was part of a long multi-year study group. 2 queries came to annual conference at about the same time from different districts, asking about what it means to be an intercultural church. These were districts that were beginning to really sort of become aware of their intercultural churches in their district, wanting to make them more comfortable, wanting to grow in this kind of way. And they they brought these queries, are we a intercultural church? Are we a multicultural church? Do we want to be? Good brethren people, we formed a study committee and we wrote some papers, and out of this it was accepted in 2007, and one of the recommendations of the paper was that there be a person assigned to intercultural ministries who would then do the work as described in the paper, remind the denomination that the paper exists and of the recommendations of it, And that's very amorphous. The paper runs about 30 pages.
So do you write your own job description? Do you kind of decide what needs to be done and go do it?
I do not write my own job description, but in fact, in many ways, I would say you, anyone watching, you write my job description for me. I'm very responsive in my work. I get calls of people that have questions and have needs and would like to take intercultural ministries further, would like to think about being intercultural in their context, would like to think about engaging with the wider community and the cultural differences that they're seeing. Right now, it's a time of great racial anxiety in our nation. And churches call me and say, how do we minister to our people at this time of anxiety? And we talk that through together, and we work on ways that fit the context.
One of the handouts you presented at the spring event had to do with hardly any of my friends are. And I was shocked to see that most whites have very few other cultural friends, and most blacks have very few other cultural friends. My question is, how do you move people? How do we get out of this description into where the church of 2007 wanted to be?
It is challenging. Wider American culture has for a very long time been set up to be segregated.
And kind of self-protective. I mean, we're segregated and we want to keep it that way. Some parts of it.
Some of us would want to keep it that way. I think a lot of us are not even aware of how intentional it is. We are the inheritors of redlining districts, which determine the housing values and who could and couldn't get mortgages and buy houses in neighborhoods. And that ran through the 80s, frankly. We are inheritors of banishment, where people of color, communities of color in places were entirely run out. We are inheritors of a segregated school system, and a school system that actually is more segregated now than it was in the 1970s when we were doing busing. One of the things that has happened is many of us will look around and say, oh, I have a black friend. There's a black person in my son's class, so my son's class is not segregated. There is a Latino person in my son's class, so my class is not segregated. And we don't realize that these small tokens of individuals and how we've tokenized them is different from true integration and desegregation. And because class is also a segregator, finances have been a main key of how segregation has worked. There are frightening numbers about how many brown and black kids go to school with only brown and black kids that are invisible to us. Mm-hmm. I think the first step is actually seeing statistics like this one. It was published by the Washington Post, but it was done by the Public Religion Research Institute. And realizing the reality of these and then looking at our lives and saying, how much does my life reflect this reality? How much am I part of the cultural norm? Mm-hmm. And then understanding the reasons behind it, because until we can really accept that this is the reality and understand why this reality exists, we can't change it.
Do you think that there are exercises or workshops that you could bring to that community of church that wants to extend themselves in the community? Do you ever do weekend workshops? Or?
I do, and as I said before, I think one of the most important things is being aware of the realities. So one of the things that I do is I get marbles and jars and jars and jars full of marbles, and actually there are a lot of jokes around the Elgin office about Gimbia losing her marbles as I go from district to district. And I ask people to consider what their lives look like. This jar of marbles, I ask people to separate them out. I give them, all of the colors are separated and they indicate different groups by ethnicity. This is the USA one, so this looks at our population numbers. In broad strokes, the white is for white Caucasian Americans, the black marbles are for black African American, the yellow is actually for Hispanic, the blue is for Asian Americans, and then the green is for people that are mixed or don't know. And it's, like I said, it's broad strokes. But I have people think about their lives.
Now that one represents the United States population.
Yes, so I have them do one that looks like what the US population looks like. And then I have them think about the people in their lives. And I ask us not to think in generic terms, but actually to close your eyes and imagine individuals.
Like your friends and your family.
Your friends and your family. They should be people that have names. People in your churches, people at work. And there are different ways that this can be done. I can do it to look at structure and hierarchy. We've also done this to look at how the Church of the Brethren gets shaped. But generally speaking, earlier you showed the diagram of the friendship circle. So this one is what the friendship circle looks like for your average white American if they were to have 100 friends. I mean, this would be the Facebook feed, so to speak. And as you can see, it's very white. And this is very reflective. They have one black friend. I always try to make sure that marble is visible.
One Latino friend.
One Latino friend, yeah.
One Asian friend.
The Asian friend, we can't see them so easily. Oh, there they are.
And one mixed race friend and one other race friend.
And so those would be the green. And then I show this is again drawing on the same study by the Public Religious Research Institute. This would be the 100 Friends of an African American. And I use this partially as an example because when we think about the realities that we know, we think about whose stories we believe, we think about what influences our mind, whose narrative is primary to us. It's who we know. And so these realities are incredibly different. And once we understand that, and this is a way that I work through this with small groups.
So once people realize what you're saying, how do we extend our comfort zone to include people different than us?
This is a question I ask groups to wrestle with. And again, I think that an answer from an outsider isn't going to necessarily be right for your community. So what does feel right for your community? What feels right for your spiritual gifts? And I think that you have to wrestle into your own answer because anything else is just prescriptive. And there isn't a right answer or a wrong answer. Who is in your community, what the diversity looks like will change. If you are in a community that has been very much impacted by, say, a group of Sudanese immigrants that have come in, that'll be a very different answer than if you were to be in a community where you're wanting to do outreach to Vietnamese people that have been there for 2 and 3 generations. There's not the same answer. You have to really look around you and decide what you want to have be different.
I find that I'm a person who doesn't reach out to people I don't know. And I don't know what to say, and as a result of that, I don't say anything. You know, whether they're handicapped or in a wheelchair or a different color or with a different background, I just don't know what to say, and so I just kind of withdraw and don't say anything. And I think that may be similar to some other people. And what do we do? What do you do with people like me who don't have a very broad comfort zone in terms of meeting and greeting and welcoming and interacting with people different than myself?
This is very dear to my heart. I'm a bit introverted.
Well,
so
that sums it up. You know, sums up introversion.
So reaching out is very hard for me. And as somebody who is reached out to, it can also, there is such a thing as sort of over friendliness, and you do feel that tokenization. I don't want to be welcomed into a space just because I'm a person of color. I want to be welcomed into a space because I'm Gimbia. And I am a person of color, and those things aren't separate, but I'm very careful about tokenization. I think that in the church, and I read an article about this published, about the differences between welcoming people of other ethnicities in churches that are conservative and progressive. And one of the things that they did was they mailed letters to various churches that had very ethnic sounding names attached to these letters, and it wrote the churches and said, I'm moving into your community and I need help, and just kind of monitored what the response back was. And some churches are much better at reaching out to individuals, and they're much better at saying, oh, we can come help you. We can come help you move. We can come help unload your van. And some churches are not as good at that. But there are also churches that are very good at having the questions about the structural pieces of it, that are more willing to look into the question of history and why do we live in segregated societies. And oftentimes these churches aren't the same church.
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time I thought, oh, if we could get all churches to do both of these things, wouldn't that be perfect? And maybe it would. But I think there's a value to this diversity of saying we gravitate and work in ways where we're gifted. And so in some ways, I think there's a challenge to say, what are the gifts that I have that I can lend and lean my shoulder into this issue to change it? For some people, that is reaching out and greeting people in the street. They have that easy, open ability to do that. And that's where they're gifted. That's where their spiritual strengths lie. So it's natural for them to do that. And they need to look at their spiritual strengths and say, okay, how do I apply this to a more diverse group? For others of us, our spiritual strengths lie in really delving in and understanding the structural pieces and saying we're a congregation that's ready to engage with our community that we know and challenge the community that we know to change the perspectives of our known community.
Mm-hmm. And
I think that really we have to also trust that we've been given different spiritual gifts because God intends for us to work in different ways.
Gimbia Kettering, thank you for being with us on Brethren Voices.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a really enjoyable conversation.
The pleasure's mine. I learned a lot. Thank you. For Brethren Voices, this is Brett Carlson.
And this is Gimbia Kettering from the Intercultural Ministries.
Wishing you peace.
We are Christians by our love, by our love. Yes, they'll know we are Christians by our love. All praise to the Father, from whom all things come, and all praise to Christ Jesus, his only Son, and all praise